Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be with you today, and missed you. Been gone for several weeks, and taking care of my lovely wife. And we want to thank you for, I don't know how the churches do this when people are in difficulty or they're sick, how well they take care of people, but boy, I sure am glad I'm at Cornerstone. Oh my goodness, really, this is really a great place, and people who brought food, cards, calls, pretty amazing. I didn't even start preaching yet. Anyway, yeah, so it's been great. It's when you have neck surgery, that's no joke, and we're not as young as we used to be. Cotton picking, trying to recover. So Betsy's doing better, a little better each day, and one of these days we're hoping her energy and health are at a much better place. So thank you for your understanding and your wonderful food and your prayers and your cards and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, thank you. Fenton asked me a few weeks ago if I had some characters in Hebrews that I'd be interested in preaching about, and so I initially said Rahab. So Rahab isn't today, but maybe we'll get to preach about her a little later. Amazing person, and but then I landed. Some things happened, as things go. In my life, and Joseph sort of jumped into my lap. So I want to talk a little bit about him today. And I like to just preach and share about things that I'm learning. When I was in the ministry, I always just had to come up with a sermon. That was part of the job. I'm not in the ministry, so I don't have to just preach a sermon. I get to draw from the things that God is currently talking to me about and teaching me and showing me about my life. I was studying the book of Philippians recently, and I was kind of reading through the first part of that chapter, and Paul's prayer for the Philippians is that they would continue to grow in their knowledge and in their understanding. And so I think my former view of that is that I would grow in my knowledge and understanding of the Bible. I want to know the Bible better. I want to understand the Bible better. But I think that understanding and knowledge goes way beyond that, in that we would grow in our knowledge and our understanding of our own lives, our own story, that we wouldn't just kind of be plugged into a book, but that we would really be plugged into our lives and understanding our lives and really knowing what's going on in our lives, to understanding the way that God works. How he really works, not how we imagine he works or we're told that he works, but how he really works in our lives. And so Paul, right after he says that, he said, I've come to understand some things more clearly recently. He said, I just got thrown into jail. And that sucks. That's just not a happy place to be. And on the surface, I think initially Paul is going, bummer. Man, I need to be out there preaching. This isn't right. God, are you asleep at the wheel? Don't you know Jesus, your son, gave me a job to do, to go preach the word, and that's what I've been doing. And now here I am. I'm stuck. I'm confined. But it dawned on him. He began to understand that he says what has actually happened here is the gospel is being preached in ways that it couldn't have been preached. I couldn't have come up with this plan. The whole palace guard knows that I'm in chains because they never would have known that. They never would have really understood Jesus to the extent that they now understand him. And he says, and besides that, all these brothers and sisters in town, they're just bolder in sharing their story about Jesus with other people. And so he says, what's actually, he uses this word, it's hard to believe, but what's actually happened, this has been a great plan. It wasn't my plan. I didn't see it as a good thing. And so what I want to draw our attention to today is that God always has the big picture in view. God has the big picture in view. We tend to focus on the small and the immediate things in our lives. We want God to fix this right now. Just fix this. Just change this. Paul was probably saying, get me out of jail. Set me loose. Turn me loose with the gospel. And that's probably what he prayed. But God's response, as we're asking him to take care of this, is always this. You know, I'm just glad God's in control and I'm not. God's response to our this is a very multifaceted, sweeping, broad, long-term, deep influences on things that are seemingly unrelated. His view, his projecting power, his influence is so vast, it's hard for us to even comprehend it. To think beyond our own immediate circumstances. He thinks and plans decades into the future. You know, we kind of try to think decades in the future as far as our finances go, right? You know, we all want to kind of be there one day. So we're thinking in those terms financially. God is thinking in those terms for us as far as our spiritual lives and the abundant life and the life that he wants us to have. You know, one of my favorite scriptures, Fenton was talking about favorite scriptures last week, right? Favorite scripture, one of mine that I would have shared is that we know in all things God works for the good of those that love him. We know that in all things, in everything, that's a lot. That's a lot just for me in my life. And you think about all the everything that's in this room, or all the everything that's on this planet, that somehow God has the capacity to very easily, without breaking a sweat, take everything that happens in our lives and works those things for good, not just for the immediate good, but for the projected good, for years, decades, and generations in the future. God is projecting that good in our lives. It's pretty amazing. You know, not everything that happens to us is good. In fact, much of it is bad, or at least it looks bad, or it feels bad. But he works that apparently looking bad, feeling bad thing. He works that not only into something good, but some things good, many things good, into the future, such as his power and influence. I can only imagine God saying, when one of these things happens, or we offer up this prayer, this desperate prayer of, help me, or something traumatic or catastrophic happens in our lives, I can only imagine God kind of pulling his team together. Jesus and the Holy Spirit, guys, come on. Let's sit down and talk about this. Look at what has just happened in this person's life. How they do that for billions of people, I'll never know. But that's just who God is. That's the kind of attention that he is capable of giving me and you. He said, let's come together on this. Look at what has just happened to this person's health, or to this family, or to this marriage, or to this life. Look at what has happened here. What can we do with this? And then they start brainstorming. And they go, well, that's a good question. What are we going to do with that? This is going to be awesome. This is going to be exciting. Okay, this is what we can do with that. Okay, we can do this, and then we can do this, and then we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this. This is the projected power of God to work everything in our lives into something good. He's not just a here and now guy. He's a forever guy. He works into our future. He's brainstorming for me because I love him for loving me. That's just what it comes down to. And this brought me to Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph. I'm going to get to Joseph. This is about all we're going to talk about Joseph. But anyway, Joseph said to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being the saving of many lives. Only God knows what came first, the chicken or the egg. Well, God wanted those guys to throw him into the pit. That's God wanted them to do that because he had plans. Well, maybe God didn't have plans until the pit started. Maybe the pit's what started the plan. Maybe it was from that, oh, cool. This is our way to go to this stepping stone, to that stepping stone, to that stepping stone, and bam, we're going to save thousands and thousands of lives. That one act of hatred, jealousy, and bitterness, God took that and just blew it up into goodness, into salvation for many, many people. And this is what I've tried to comprehend, is that this is not a rare occurrence. This is not an exception to the rule. This was not just a unique, special person on the planet that God just said, this is what I'm going to do for him. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says that's what he does for all of us who love him. This is the norm for God. This is just who God is. This is just what God does. It's his habit. It's his specialty. He's had lots of practice, and it gives him great pleasure. You know how much pleasure it gives you to do just a small act of kindness for somebody? I mean, it's just like, God, man, that was so, man, I'm feeling good about that. That was so awesome to do something for somebody that they couldn't do for themselves. To provide something for someone that they had no resources, but I had some, and so just the small act of kindness, how much pleasure that gives us. How much pleasure do you think it gives God to take somebody's life and to utterly redirect it, to absolutely turn it upside down or right side up and expand that, make that funnel. He intercepted that life. And from there, he says, okay, this is where we're going with this. How much pleasure do you think that gives God? I think a lot of pleasure. I think that he gets jacked up on that stuff. That's what he does. That's who he is. That's the norm, not the exception for you in your life. And it's so hard for us to see it right now because we're still in the pit. You know, where am I? Got to look at my notes again. And it's not so much about us. It's about what God can accomplish through and in spite of our sin, our failure, and our brokenness. So let's debunk the idea that the lives of faith are all buttoned up and put together. You know, you kind of get that idea when you read Hebrews chapter 11, how awesome it all was. Oh, my gosh. They quenched the fire. They shut the mouths of lions. They turned weakness into strength. Holy mackerel. I think probably some of those guys who grew up with those people were going, who are you talking about? That's not the guy I knew. That's not the guy I met. That's not the guy I encountered. He was anything but that. But isn't it great? That's what God remembers about us. You know, these guys made some good decisions they made a ton of bad decisions. In spite of those bad decisions. And through those bad decisions and through those failures, that, you know, they were tested so many times. Sometimes they passed the test, but often they failed. But God never flunked them. You think about it. I wouldn't want to trade places with them. The passage, God works all things together for good to those who love him. I wonder when that started. I mean, did that apply to the Old Testament guys? Well, yeah, it did. It did apply to them. It wasn't just for us. Did these people love God? Well, yes. Did they love him all the time? All of their lives? Did they love him? Well, did David love God when he was in bed with Bathsheba? Oh, I love you, God. Did David love God when he arranged the murder of her husband? Did he love God? I don't think he was thinking about God. I think he was thinking about protecting his own rear end. Did Abraham love God when Pharaoh wanted this woman beside him, and Abraham's going, hubba, she's my sister. And Sarah goes, what? You talk about marriage problems. They probably had something to talk about after that was all over. And he didn't do it once, he did it twice. Did he love God when he was giving his wife away to have sex with Pharaoh or King Abimelech? We could go down the whole list, right, of these heroes who failed on so many occasions in their lives. But how somehow these messy lives of faith, God accomplished so many wonderful things. You know, we're familiar with these people's stories. But I think many times we're unfamiliar with our own. We haven't reached the point where we can connect the dots. And, you know, it's hard to do that when you're a young person because you don't have that too many dots to connect. But as you get older, as you begin to look back, if we take the time, which it's hard to do, right? Because we're busy. We've got jobs that call for and demand our attention. We have only so much energy. When we get home and we're tired, we get up, we're tired, we're in a rush to do this, or there's a situation that needs our attention right then. And so it's so hard for us to really take the time to consider deeply our own lives and our own story, to see the things that God has been doing in our lives before we were even thought of, to get us to the point where we are today, and to even begin to think about where my faith will take my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. And so that's our challenge, really, I think, to really stop and think about it. You know, 15 years ago, Sherman Davis and I and J.P. Tynes and Don Burrows, Joe Woods, Andy Van Buren started meeting at my house. We were called the X-Men. We were all ex-ministers. Wham! And, you know, it was really funny. We only had one rule. I mean, this was after, you know, the big shakedown. And I thought, you know, I think I've told you this before. I said, you know, God, before I die, I was in my 50s. I said, before I die, help me to find some true friendships. And so we began to meet together once a week. And our only rule was you can't talk about anything but yourself. And so I don't know how we came up with it. We said, okay, each week for the first several weeks, we want everybody to tell their story. I said, because I knew Sherman from church. I knew JP from church. I knew, you know, but we didn't really know each other. I just knew this much about them. I remember Sherman had to write his mom and have her mail pictures and stuff, his yearbook and stuff. And so we sat down each night and just told our story as we understood it at that time. I understand so much more about my story today than I did then, but I told it as best I could. And it was good for us all to have to sit down and go, I'm going to share my story with somebody. We had pictures. This is me when I was a kid. These are my brothers and my sisters. My mom, you know, this is me in high school. I know I was pretty much a goober, but anyway, you know, all this kind of stuff. Okay, I'm doing good. At least I think I am. So God, help us to understand our story. Enlighten me about my history, to see your faithful guidance, your discipline, your compassion, your grace, stepping stones, transitions, in helping me to grow up into Christ and make a difference in this world. I don't think many of our heroes understood or saw it until much later in their lives. Some of them didn't see it until after they died. Which brings me to the second reason I wanted to study Joseph. I made a trip this year to see my cousin in Springfield, Missouri. To learn about my family. I lost my dad when I was 27. There's a whole lot about my dad's life I never knew because I didn't think about asking. I was too busy. I was too immature to care or to think it would make any difference about my father's childhood. Boy, I wish I could talk to him today. The questions I would ask him, the things that I would be interested in. And so I learned so much about my dad. He never spoke about his childhood, and now I know why. It was not a happy childhood. My cousin, oldest cousin in the cousin group, never married. She stayed there in Springfield where my dad was raised, and she was close to my grandmother. And my grandmother told her things that she never told anyone. So I want you to introduce you to my grandmother. She wasn't that fat. It really... She was a short person. I'm sorry, grandmother. I didn't know it was going to come out like that. They told me they were having problems back there, and now I understand why. That's okay. Her name's Bertha Gooch. Bert. She married my grandfather, Will. We got a better picture of her and Will up there, maybe? Are you going to be... Yeah, they're pretty fat, too. That's Will. They married, she was 18, he was 19. My grandfather, you can take that down. My grandfather was not a good man. He was a drunk. He was a bootlegger. He was unfaithful to my grandmother on many occasions. Most Fridays, she would sit on the front porch with my father and his brother and wonder when Will was going to come home, and when he came home, if he had any money left. They weren't quite sure where they would live the next week, month, a few months. When she found out she was pregnant for her third child, in desperation, she gave herself an abortion. As she practically bled to death in the hospital, my grandfather was out with a prostitute. You know, the plight of women 100 years ago wasn't very good, was it? She was trapped in a marriage with a man who could care less, for whatever reason, was struggling with the things she was struggling with. How could this possibly have a happy ending? As she wept in desperation, going, God, help me. Help me. Why? How many people die and wonder if their life counted? If their life made a difference? Did I make a difference? Did I live my life in vain? She was raised in a Christian home. Somehow, through this whole experience, she did not lose her faith. Incredible. Somehow, through her faith, my father at 14 or 15 years old became a Christian. He graduated from high school when he was 16. He had nothing. Out of the kindness of her heart, a woman in their church says, I'll give Wallace a year's worth of school at Freed-Hardeman College. So at 16, my father escapes. You know, my father never said a disparaging word about his father. Not one. It blows my mind. I don't know if it was out of shame or out of just, he didn't want me to disrespect his dad, who later became a Christian, by the way. So my father escapes at 16. He goes to Freed-Hardeman. Before the year's out, he gets kicked out of school for holding a girl's hand. Yeah, that's pretty serious. He hears somehow, and I hadn't figured this out, that they're looking for preachers in Texas, in a little town called Nolanville. He hitchhikes, finds his way into Nolanville. Next picture is my father and my grandfather, and this is my father in the middle, Wallace Gooch. The man on his right is my grandfather, Nate Sprott. Nate was an elder in the church for 50 years. Those are his two boys, NH on his far right, and Billy Mack. He's a cowboy. He was married to Billie Jane. I think I told you this a while ago. And anyway, my father providentially met Nate Sprott, who took him into their home. He loved him. He saw something special in him. Those two men became his best friends, and their sister became his wife. My dad preached the gospel for 40 years. The 50s and 60s. Hundreds, thousands of people were being baptized during those days. Church of Christ was the fastest growing denomination in the United States. He was in the middle of it. See how much time I got here. Yikes. Okay, you can put that one down. My father finally got the love and the family that he never had. He had 3 boys, my other brothers and I. I got to tell you a couple of little stories. My boyhood home was Austin, Texas. And I loved being in Austin. I grew up there and had all my friends there. Well, my dad decides we're going to move to Altus, Oklahoma. He was really trying to get away from his secretary at church who was after him. So we moved to Altus, Oklahoma. It was horrible. It was I was 13 or 14 years old. I had no friends. I was being bullied. And I decided to steal my brother's car one night. A Corvair, really a hot rod. It was something else. So my friend Randy Grimes and I sneak out, and we push the car out of the driveway. I'd never driven a car before. So we push it out, and we crank it up, and man, we take off. And we're going through the neighborhood, the streets like this. Well, I end up wrecking the car in the Baptist preacher's yard. We're sitting there. Grimes just he abandons me right there. I finally get the car started before the Baptist preacher woke up. And I start trying to get this car home. Well, I'd blown 2 tires. So about a block or 2 from home, I go, you know what? The gig is up. So I go into my mom and dad's room. Mom and dad, wake up. What? I wrecked Eddie's car. All my mother could say was, whoop him, Wally. So, Wally didn't whoop me. Yeah, but I was a desperate kid. I was unhappy. I couldn't understand why God would take me out of Austin, Texas and send me to Altus, Oklahoma. I understand it now. I was getting left behind athletically in Austin. I didn't make the football team, which I really wanted to make. I moved to Altus, start playing football again, okay. Thank the Lord, we moved back to Texas, to Temple, start playing a little football. Then one day I accidentally tackle somebody. It was an accident. Honestly, it was an amazing tackle. My coach was fired up about it. And things changed right there. It seems silly, I know. But things in my life, that was a turning point for me. I learned that it didn't hurt. And I became more aggressive. And ultimately, they elected me as the captain of the team in my senior year. But that set the stage for me in whatever leadership capacity the Lord has led me from that point. But leaving Austin, Texas was horrible. I didn't like it. It didn't feel good. I couldn't see any good coming out of it. But in my small way, that changed the direction in my life. Okay. Kind of got off track. I wonder what Bertha Gooch is thinking today. You know, Isaiah says about Jesus, Isaiah 53, when he saw the results of the suffering of his soul, he was satisfied. Ephesians chapter 3 says, you know, God is able to do far more than we could ask or imagine. And I think this is just really what this story tells me, and I hope will tell you, wherever you are in your life today, however stuck or insignificant you may feel, don't let go of your faith. That my grandmother is sitting up there now just shaking her head going, I cannot even believe the results of my shred of faith that I clung to, my life, as she looks at my father and my brothers and my brother's children and our children's children, as she sees this funnel of goodness expand. It's truly miraculous to her, and it's all about the glory of God. Hebrews chapter 12, since we're surrounded by such a huge cloud of witnesses, as my grandmother looks down upon me and she's witnessing my life, the life of my children, and she's going, that has become a part of my faith. I am so satisfied. I can't even believe what God has done with my suffering. And so he says, I want you, they ran their race. And so he's telling us, well, now you run your race. There's somebody who ran their race before you. Who was that person? Where can you trace back your faith? And it hasn't started for most of us with the Church of Christ. It started somewhere much further back than that. Somebody who had faith in Jesus that was passed down, and without you even knowing it, you had some inclination. There was something there that was given to you. So I want to close out with a poem. My dad was a guy that loved poems. And this poem is called, What I Live For. I live for those who love me, for those I know are true, for the heaven that smiles above me and awaits my spirit too, for all the human ties that bind me, for the task my God assigned me, for the bright hopes yet to find me, and the good which I can do. I live to learn their story. It's important that I knew my grandmother's story. I learned to live their story, who've battled for my sake. See, I'm not just running this race for me. I'm running my race for somebody else. I'm battling for somebody who's on the next step. He said, I lived to learn their story who battled for my sake. The patriot crowned with glory, the martyr at the stake. Bards, prophets, heroes, sages, the noble of all ages. My grandmother was a noble woman whose deeds crown history's pages, my family's history, and time's great volume make. I live to hold communion with all that is divine, to feel there is a union twixt nature's heart and mine, to profit by affliction, reap truths from fields of fiction, grow wiser from conviction, and fulfill God's grand design. I live to hail the season by gifted ones foretold, when men shall live by reason and not alone for gold, when man to man united and every wrong thing righted, the whole world shall be delighted as Eden was of old. I live for those who love me, for those who know me true, for the heaven which smiles above me and awaits my spirit too, for the cause that lacks assistance, for the wrong that needs resistance, for the future in the distance, and the good that I can do. Amen.